Olá pessoal, aqui é o Fábio Stern e este vídeo é um recorte da apresentação que eu fiz na IANESE quando fui convidado nesse congresso internacional para falar um pouco sobre como que a naturologia brasileira lida com a questão de medicina chinesa, como que isso é entendido e absorvido dentro dos meios de naturologia. O congresso era internacional, portanto a fala está em inglês. Então, para aqueles que não conseguem falar inglês, a minha gravação também está bem ruim, então até está um pouco difícil de entender alguns momentos, porque a minha conexão não estava boa no dia. Mas eu disponibilizei as legendas para vocês. Então, basta clicar no ícone CC, Closed Caption, e ativar as legendas aqui pelo YouTube para ter a tradução.
Concerning my speech today, naturology was my objective study in both my master's and doctorate, although I've no longer dedicated myself to this objective. Since 2019, I focus my speech today on the institutionalization of naturology in Brazilian universities, which occurred long before I stopped studying this. Naturology is an esoteric health movement that emerged in the 19th century in Southern Europe due to the increasing industrialization of medicine. Although it is similar to naturopathy created in Germany around the same time, initially naturology was a distinct movement typical of Italy and the Iberian Peninsula. From their emergence to the mid-20th century, naturologists based their practice on vitalism and parapsychology, mixing esoteric Christianity with folk health practice. Their known allopathic techniques were already traditional to Europe, such as diets, baths, massages, and medical plants. But after the New Age movement, the European naturalists turned away from parapsychology and Christian esotericism toward quantum mysticism in Asia, mostly Chinese practices such as acupuncture and tuina, and Indian techniques such as Ayurveda and yoga. The naturology societies in Europe nowadays are much more influenced by Asian than by Christian esotericism. The New Age Orientalism, its vast presence in the alternative medicines milieu, are primarily responsible for that. In Brazil, naturology has a distinguished trajectory. Spain, Portugal, and Italy have always had reservation about regulating naturology, since it is a form of esotericism. In Brazil, however, naturology has been a university course recognized by the Brazilian Ministry of Education since 2002. So while naturology suffered governmental defeats and could not open college courses with state recognition, at least in Europe, Brazil authorizes and recognizes naturology bachelor degrees. This makes Brazil naturology unique, bringing it closer to similar academic legitimacy-seeking movements such as osteopathy in the United States. There is empirical evidence of a diffuse naturology presence in Brazil society since at least the 1980s. Nonetheless, its proper insertion into Brazilian higher education occurred in 1994. Their first college course was at Faculdades Integradas Espírita, a Spiritist private college in Curitiba. Octavio Melquiades Ulícia, the founder and former owner of this college, personally invited Jorge de Moraes Barbosa to design a course not in naturology, but in traditional Chinese medicine. Barbosa was already a professor in Recife, in the Brazilian Northeast, and he was also a practitioner of Umbanda, a esoteric syncretism between African diaspora religions and Spiritism. Thus, the history of this first naturology course in Brazil began with a biomedical doctor who was also an acupuncturist trying to create a traditional Chinese medicine undergraduate degree in a spiritist college. However, in Brazil, the medical professor is strongly regulated. Thus, when the course designed by Barbosa was presented to the Brazilian Ministry of Education for authorization, they could not keep the title traditional Chinese medicine. The term medicine was the problem. Since the naturology in Portugal was already strongly oriented toward traditional Chinese practice back then, changing the naming of the course to naturology was only natural. In other words, when Brazil created its first naturology college course, its founder's goal was to establish a traditional Chinese medicine program. Since the 2000s, Brazilian naturology has adopted other health practices to its teachings. Today, anthroposophic medicine, Ayurveda, and shamanic healing also figure in the Brazilian naturology curriculum. but the initial goal was to focus on China. For that, traditional Chinese medicine has been taught in Brazil in all of the naturology courses whenever. Other Chinese body practices, such as Liangong, Qigong, and Tai Chi, have also been part of its history. As a reflection, Passos attested that 61% of Brazilian naturologists state that they always work with traditional Chinese medicine. Moreira also pointed out that it's the most common subject of naturology papers in Brazil. In 2016, 85% of the academic supervisors of naturology Brazilian courses had also some technical training in traditional Chinese medicine. The importance of traditional Chinese medicine in Brazilian naturology is such that they even mingle non-Chinese practices with it. Some prominent examples are chromotherapy, crystal healing, dowsing, clay therapy. None of those is part of the traditional corpus of Chinese healing. But in a very creative way, Brazilian naturologists blend Western techniques into China's system, creating very particular and innovative forms of therapy. To do so, they superficially mix different pieces of knowledge into one big synthesis. In some cases, after they make the creative invention, the naturologists themselves may deny the influences from which they drew such practices in the first place. The most prominent example here is Peter Mendel's chromopuncture, which is heavily oriented by acupuncture, but whose creator himself denies such influence. Brazilian naturologists identify themselves very much with traditional Chinese medicine. Such identification, however, is similar to New Age Orientalism. They like things from Asia, but from a view of that of colonialist West consider Asia is mystical, wise, ancient, magical, etc. The Brazilian naturology disregards what Asian scholars themselves are saying about it nowadays. Though some Brazilian universities had hired professors from China, the Chinese professors present a different view on Chinese medicine from the Western New Age sources. So the naturology universities usually left those Chinese professors on the sidelines. Highlighting the case of Professor Yu Tao and Li Qingyong, they moved from China to southern Brazil to teach traditional Chinese medicine for naturology courses. They were given, however, a minor role in developing the lesson plans and methods of teaching. Although they were hired to do so, they were not responsible for the classes and supervised clinical practices. My analysis is that the Brazilian naturology universities hired Chinese professors mainly as so. Since the emergence of the first bachelor degree, nature also had offered professional training in acupuncture. Despite this, there is some controversy regarding acupuncture's teachings for naturologists. As I said, medicine is a strongly regulated profession in Brazil with a powerful federal council. For more than 2 decades, the Brazil Council of Medicine has been fighting for acupuncture to be a physician's exclusive practice. The Workers' Party past governments have dared attempts to reserve the market for medicine in Brazil, which means that at least for now, it is still possible for other professionals, such as nurses or physical therapists, to apply acupuncture here in the country. This dispute, nonetheless, splits the Brazilian naturology collective. While some naturology universities teach basic needling techniques to undergraduate students, others adopt a more conservative stance that acupuncture is an invasive treatment, so it should only be present at the graduate level. Besides avoiding unnecessary conflicts with the Council of Medicine, the later group considers acupuncture needs a much larger workload to form safe professionals. As Brazilian naturology has become more pluralistic over time, Chinese medicine no longer constitutes half of the training in naturology as it used to be in Brazil. But by focusing on training generalists, Brazilian naturology programs launches into the market professors who know a bit of everything but cannot work deeply with anything without taking extra courses. Despite this, Brazilian naturology still dedicates an average of 600 hours to traditional Chinese medicine. Considering that Brazilian law stipulates that a bachelor degree must have 3,600 hours, Chinese medicine is 1/60 of a naturology undergraduate degree here in Brazil. No other subject has that many hours in Brazilian naturology programs today. Even so, the World Health Organization suggests at least 500 hours of supervised clinical practices. Brazilian naturology does only 450 hours, and these are not limited to traditional Chinese medicine, as the World Health Organization states. In addition, the World Health Organization recommends at least 432 hours of basic theory in traditional Chinese medicine. Brazilian naturology courses do only 150, one-third of the international recommendation. This brings us to a crucial point in the training of naturologists in Brazil. Even though the courses give great attention to it, the naturology alumni are not qualified as traditional Chinese therapists. They only learn the basics, but with a course load below the World Health Organization recommendations. A naturologist in Brazil needs specialization to meet the international benchmarks. The undergraduate degree alone is not enough. Unfortunately, Brazil academia cares very little about the post-university life of its alumni. Many courses seem to exist only to satisfy professional personal projects or to make money from study fees. But this is another conversation. Thank you for listening all the way through, and I open to comments and questions in the end.
I mean, that was another question. I thought, like, you are criticizing Fabio in a sense. I get a sense. Are you talking about a kind of bland sort of? They're criticized because there's a lot of bland entanglement there. I think that's what I was wondering in your presentation. You were sort of saying something about that Brazil people get criticized because it's like a particular type of entanglement that doesn't really change. And I just wanted to check.
I criticize the Brazilian naturology because they don't listen to what the Chinese are doing nowadays. They don't like to listen to Chinese scholars. They hire Chinese professors, but they hire them and they are put in the shelf. That's where they stay. They don't have a true voice. They don't have power to choose the pedagogical methods, the syllabus of the classes, or things like that. They hire Chinese professors, but in the end, the reference are European. They like to read German and French and people from the United States. That's their reference on Chinese medicine, not what the Chinese are producing about their own traditional medicine.
Can I ask just a very
This is a really interesting point. Go ahead.
Is anyone equipped to read Chinese to begin with?
Yes, I met two professors. One of them is called Fernando Silva. He's a Brazilian. He don't speak Chinese, but he reads Chinese. Once they hired Chinese professors to Brazil, those Chinese professors can read Chinese, and they can translate Chinese papers into Portuguese. But the Brazilian naturology, they are very inclined to New Age. The New Agers, Tarcísio has a very romantic view on China.
Yeah, so who are these Chinese? Is people from China or...
From China.
Are these people from China equipped to translate stuff into Portuguese?
They so
came
hard.
to Brazil, they speak Portuguese and Chinese.
Whoa.
They could do that, but the naturology universities don't take them too serious. That's the problem.
So they find Chinese people who can speak Portuguese, bring them all the way to Brazil, and don't listen to what they have to say.
Yes, and they are put
That's very interesting.
in the refrigerator, as we call. They are there just as a token. I think they use those professors to attract students, but they don't have power in the naturology programs. That's a very sad thing.
Where does that come from? Is this a cultural thing? Is this like a Portuguese thing that's then in Brazil, or what is it?
I think it's a New Age thing. When you bring Chinese professors to Brazil, the New Age view on Chinese medicine is that China is ancient, is old, and they say, no, Chinese medicine, although it's traditional, we are still studying this and we are still developing it nowadays. And
it's
we are not
thing.
studying in 3 millennia ago. We are doing this today. The Brazilian naturologists, they want that mystical ancient China fantasy with their Chinese medicine. In fact, it's a very colonialist view.
What you said, it very much reminds me of Orientalism and this exotization. But the interesting thing is that it is present not just when the West looks at the East, it is present a lot when the East looks at itself. So we have it a lot among my teachers. They try to represent what we do. Rather than focus on the now, on the how we do it now, on the developing it, it is important for many masters to represent it as old as 5,000 years old, as this old thing. And it is a very interesting thing. It is definitely this self-orientalization, self-exotization. And I'm sure it's not just in the East. Probably the Western people also do it to themselves to a certain degree.
I mean, I think what we're seeing is basically, this is my idea of myself. And then you knock up against the reality of what I think is true versus what other people think is true and other people are doing. And that uncomfortable space, right? So that's the thing that's interesting to me is you get the Occidentalism, you get the Orientalism, you get all these multiple modes of exoticism because people are curious about stuff, but they're also like, I want to protect myself, right? And so it's a totally human thing to be like, I want to go over here and try this thing that looks interesting and I can kind of make sense out of it, but I let go of some parts that don't, which is where you get stuff like bricolage, right? You get like, I'm interested in this piece and that's what I hold on to. And then I retreat into myself because it's comfortable. So like it's when somebody says something is traditional, it's like, oh, that's what they want for the future. Is this conflict of self, not self engagement that we see.